San Diego Comic-Con at home, and welcome to the Reimagining the Past, Present, and Future of Science Fiction and Fantasy panel. I'm Sarah Peed, Senior Editor at Del Rey, and I'll be your moderator today. Today we'll be discussing influential stories of the past and present, and how the wonderful authors with me today are reimagining stories for the future. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right into the discussion. Mikaya, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, I'm Mikaya Johnson. I'm the author of The Space Between Worlds. Other than that, I'm a fairly boring academic person. So I guess that's all there is to say about that.
Heather, if you'd like to go next.
Hey, I'm Heather Walter, and I am the author of Malice. Other than writing, I'm also a librarian, so it's fairly safe to say that I am always surrounded by stories and continuously plotting.
And finally, Simon.
I am Simon Jimenez, and I'm the author of The Vanished Birds, and that's all I am.
Exactly.
All of you are wonderful. I'd just like to put that out there.
Thank you.
All right, so I like to kick off panels with an extremely tough question right out the gate. Could you each give us a brief description of your book for the folks at home? Mikaya, if you'd like to go first.
I'm convinced you put me first because you know how terrible I am at this, and you're just trying to train me to eventually get good at it.
What?
Joke's on you. I'm still bad at it. So my book, The Space Between Worlds, is about Kara, who is a character who travels between worlds, both literally because her job is to travel through the multiverse and collect data, and also traveling through like economic worlds and social worlds and these different kind of class and race spaces. And so a lot of the book is mostly about her reconciling her relationship to the places she's come from and the places she's going to, and how, you know, fraught that is as a very ambitious person who kind of is always looking forward, that occasionally something, you know, you kind of have to look behind. So it's mostly about that journey, but also murder, mayhem, and traveling through worlds. So spectacular things as well. It's not as boring as I just made it sound, I promise.
Didn't sound boring at all. And
Yeah, that was great.
You did great. I feel like I don't know what you're talking about. You are fantastic. Heather, if you would like to go next.
Hey, so I wrote Malice, and Malice is a Sleeping Beauty retelling told from the point of view of the villain, and the villain and Sleeping Beauty are actually in love. So it is a queer retelling, and there is also a lot of mayhem and a little bit of murder thrown in, and a very kind of turned around fairy tale retelling.
Awesome.
Starting to think we should have called this the Murder and Mayhem panel. Simon, if you would like to go next.
No murder and mayhem in mine, unfortunately. But
that's not necessarily true. I've read it.
Oh, you have it? Sorry, I'm lying. I just wanted to be clever. Yeah, so my book, The Vanished Birds, is a science fiction novel set in the far future. It follows a commercial starship captain who is charged with having to take care of a young boy who may or may not have the power to disrupt corporate-ruled interstellar space. That's the spine of the book, but a lot of the narrative kind of wanders through time, deep time, just following different lives of different characters in the fringes of the universe, while the mystery of the boy and his relationship with that captain slowly unfolds.
And maybe a touch of murder and mayhem.
Just a little bit, according to
Heather. Thank you all so much. So next question. Stories told about us, told to us, and told by us are one of the many things that form and change our identities. You each explore that concept in different ways in your novels, but I want to take a look behind the book and talk a little bit about the stories that influence you all as writers. What are some of the stories from books, movies, shows, video games, what have you, that played a part in forming you into the writer that you are today? Heather, if you'd like to kick it off.
Oh man, this is such like a broad question. I have been longer than I've wanted to write. I probably have been addicted to stories. Like I have just always loved stories. History was a lot of times my favorite class in school because I didn't really look at it as memorizing facts and times. Like it was just all of these interwoven stories to me, and I just loved it. So stories in any medium, I absolutely adore. In terms of video games, I tend to be pretty drawn to the role-playing ones. Skyrim, like I can get lost in days and days. Yes. And I'm not even doing anything interesting. I just want to buy all the and like arrange my weapons so I can just visit them. Sims, I have sunk years of my life into building the houses, making sure the characters don't ever age. I think that could be something I talk about. Anyway, I digress. And in terms of stories, though, I remember from a very young age, the first character who really made an impact on me was the evil queen in Disney's original Snow White. And I just remember being really sad when she died, to the point that I cried. And my mom, I think, thought that I was just this very sensitive little girl who was sad to see a woman get pushed off a cliff, which is, legit. But really, when I was upset about it, watching it, I was just as upset that the evil queen wasn't in the story anymore. And I was upset that she didn't get what she wanted, because I felt like it wasn't like a lot to ask, to be prettiest, not to murder your stepdaughter. But I was really upset that she was no longer in the story. And from that point on, I can kind of draw a line from her through every villain that I've come across, being far more interested in their story, because their story wasn't the story that was told. They were just kind of a prop to propel the hero through the action. And I wanted to know more about these characters. And so that eventually led me to writing villain stories, including Malice.
Simon, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. Skyrim's awesome. Yeah, a lot of my childhood was escaping into different mediums because life sucks. And you want to just go into different worlds. I really love like old PS1 Japanese role-playing games, 90s, early 2000s anime. In terms of reading, I remember thinking about the question. I remember like my first literary book that I read on my own willingly outside of school, and it was The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. Like it's just on my sister's shelf, and I like read the first line, and then it was like that thing where it's like you read one line and you like the act of reading that line, and then you read the next line. And it's like that was like the first book where I appreciated like reading work that felt crafted and intentional, and I think got me into like more quote unquote serious fiction, stuff like that. So, and then that kind of blended in with my love of everything that's genre, like in any medium whatsoever. There.
Always down to discuss early 90s Japanese and anime. Kaya, you're up next.
I don't know what I was gonna say before Simon's answer, but certainly like I'm the youngest child, I'm the youngest sister. Youngest of my sisters and my cousins. So I'm just like this little baby in the mix. And so playing video games for me was like laying on the couch and watching my older sisters play Silent Hill. And there's like a terror and a comfort that like have wrapped in one that I've never really gotten over, where I'm terrified of horror movies, but I watch them all because it's also comforting. And I think that the part of that most formed my storytelling process is like, there are ways in which terror can be combated with community, or if you're going through the terror with somebody that you trust or something, and I think that as a writer, I don't want to shy away from, things that are horrible, but I want it to be an experience that the reader, feels cradled through, as opposed to kind of like, I think we've all read those books where it just feels like gratuitous. It feels like there's no care. We're just like, oh, this is darkness for darkness' sake. And I think that like that experience of like being wrapped in a blanket and watching Silent Hill as my sisters played, it really like, that's the kind of terror that you want, where it's like a terror, but you also trust like the process that the terror is bringing you through. The other things for books, super formative for me, is people talk a lot about, and there's a twist or two in my book, like a twist. I love a good twist. I love a good reveal. 1 or 2 or 3, like 6, it's fine. But for me, like I was 100% raised on like cheesy murder mysteries. That was my grandma's thing. Murder mystery audiobooks all the time in the car, and figuring out who did it, and like seeing the foreshadowing, and like watching all of those things. Like I've seen every episode of Murder, She Wrote at least 10 times, and there are a lot. And so I think that kind of the drama of the twist and like playing with the character is like in my DNA, no matter what genre I'm writing. And I just like that I don't think a ton, like every reader doesn't come like, who's going to be the bad guy? Like, where's the twist? But, you know, mystery readers certainly do. Like, they're really sophisticated at that. And so like kind of writing for that in mind is absolutely comes straight from being, once again, like through other people, I found these like kind of references. So for me, it's like whenever I tell you about an art I love, I can tell you the person I love that kind of attached me to it. But that's certainly like helped form me.
I add, like, I love what you said about like horror as a sense of comfort and like almost like a sense of community.
Yeah.
It's a very communal experience, isn't it? Yeah, I love
Yes. We're all in the
experiencing that.
cabin.
Yeah,
How are we going to
exactly.
survive?
Yeah.
We've been playing a lot of Dead by Daylight recently. That's probably something too. Get on your generators.
And I also just love the idea of invoking a level of trust as a storyteller, and learning that from Silent Hill, which traumatized me as a child. I loved it.
Oh.
It traumatized me.
The worst.
The worst.
Keep going back, but
I can't do it. I'll get there. I'll get there one day.
I'm in a toxic relationship with Silent Hill. Like, don't trust me.
It's fair. It's fair. So my next question is, why did you choose science fiction and fantasy as the vehicle in which to tell your stories? Simon, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yeah, sure. I don't know.
Okay, good.
I was like, oh, I don't know how to answer this question. I mean, I always wanted to write a science fiction book, and I figured my first one, why not science fiction? And I think I'm a very image first kind of writer, where it's like I have like some kind of visual thing, motif or whatever in my head. And like in this one, it was like the image of someone like touching down on a planet outside of a spaceship. It's like, it's very classic and traditional image, but it's like I want to write about something that had that can justify that image. Yeah, that's it. And yeah, I also like started with like the opening story first, which is a romance story that takes place over one person's lifetime while someone else doesn't age, but they're like weaving in and out of like another dimension or whatever. And I had that story first, and I was like, well, this is obviously a science fiction or science something, fantasy fiction story. The rest is implied after that, and then you kind of just follow the world that is implied from that one story after that. Yeah.
Love that. Science fiction is an incredible vehicle to play with the concept of time, which you do masterfully.
Thank you.
Mikaya, if I can go to you next.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you, Simon, for not having like a perfect formulaic answer, because I was just like, if he gets this one right and I get it wrong, what are my points? For me, I don't know if I necessarily chose science fiction or if it chose me. I came up through like the university creative writing system, which does nothing but denigrate everything fun and profitable.
Yes.
100%. But I was fortunate enough to have my mentor in writing, Pat Rizal, is a poet. And he was always quick to just be like, you don't have to write for anyone, this because some workshop says nonfiction's not allowed, He kept reading my work and saying, you get right up to a place where it feels like something fantastic is going to happen. And then you pull it back to reality. You make it a metaphor, you make it a dream, a hallucination, whatever. And he's like, I just feel like you're kind of writing against yourself. And eventually, over like, I think drinks or something, we decided that it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to tell the story of the desert in any way rooted in sheer reality, because it just breeds as untrue, because it's not a terribly real place, right? It's a very mythic place. And so that was one of those things where it's like, this is a story that I want to write, and it's impossible. And the story that I wanted to write was somebody walking through the desert and coming upon their own face, because you never feel as alone as when you're in the desert. The terror of the forest is you might not be alone. The terror of the desert is you are. And so then when you finally see civilization and it's your own face, and like that was like the image I wanted to chase. And what made that possible is like a science fiction. Plus, there's so many things I'm kind of annoyingly always pursuing these themes of things in our world that we're trying to figure out. And there's something so great about science fiction as a vessel to exploring things like my book is essentially a kind of exploration of privilege, where it's like, if you were born here, what happens? If you were born here, what happens? And seeing that very concretely across these worlds just kind of literalizes that which we already know about our world. And there's something about science fiction that allows you to make literal the things that you feel and you experience every day in this like kind of bombastic way that other people can then receive and read for themselves. And that's something that makes it really great. It's like the sugar that goes with the medicine, where people can then kind of take it in and apply it to their lives and like see how it fits in their world.
the idea of science fiction sort of chasing you down also.
No, stop running.
I'm just picturing science fiction like Terminatoring after you.
Yes.
Heather, if you'd like to close this one out for us.
Yeah, sure. So I read that question on the list and I was like, I wrote a Sleeping Beauty retelling. Like, it had to be. So, but it's funny because then I thought about it and then I was like, oh, I guess I could have like done it in another, like I could have made it realistic and just taken the magic out, but that would have been boring. So anyway, to me, the magic in Sleeping Beauty, it has always been there. The cursed spindle, the dark fairy. And so it never even occurred to me to write it in any other genre. But the reason that I did go with Sleeping Beauty and that particular villain in that world was all of the one common theme that almost all of the retellings have is that there is a single dark fairy. She is the only one. There are all of these good fairies flying around, granting their wishes, getting invited to parties and eating on fancy plates. And there is a single dark fairy who is not invited to those parties and whose magic is shunned. But it's like, why would your magic be shunned if like magic exists? Isn't it awesome? And so I really wanted to explore, why is there that one fairy? Where did she come from? She had to have a past. What happened to the rest? She didn't just like spring up out of the earth. Where are the rest of her, and why might the kingdom or whatever the world be afraid of her and her magic? And that was really the seed that grew the magic system in my book and defined the characters, who she was and how her magic worked and all of that.
Thank you, Heather.
Can I add one more thing?
Please.
Just came to me. I forgot to say it. Like Micaiah, I also am very well versed in how genre fiction or any genre elements are like treated inside of a creative writing academic program. And where was it going with this? Yeah, the idea that there is like a certain kind of acceptable representation of truth in fiction, and genre fiction isn't that. It's so strange to me because like, what is more central to the human experience in our own imagination and our fantasies and desires? And like, also nothing is real. Everything is subjective through our own experiences. So it's like, you don't know the limits of the world, and just to box yourself inside of that for the sake of like traditions and social realism is very limiting and silly.
Yeah, I'm just gonna tiny clap so as not to mess up the audio.
Strong agree. Tiny clap. Thank you. Okay. We have taken a quick dip into the past, but now I want to talk to you about 3 important books of the present that are near and dear to me, each of yours. Each of your books, The Space Between Worlds, Malice, and The Vanished Birds, are your first published novels. When you sat down to write your debuts, what kind of themes and issues were you hoping to tackle? Kaya, if you want to go first.
Yeah, for sure. I love the presupposition this question has of my planning ability. It's just so generous. First of all, and I know this is true of me, I've always said it's true of most writers, but I'm not going to like put you all in here with me. But for me, it's like, this is like not the first novel I've ever written. It's just the first that I've ever like taken this far, right? You've got that wind full of like those like hideous, like, I don't know, for me, it was like teenage, stories of angst and robots and vampires, but like that kind of stack. But for this, I felt like I was approaching it differently from the start. And for me, I began writing in 2016. So I don't know if I consciously thought out the plans and that it was going to be a walled city and any of that, or if it just came from, there was so much in the air and the media and society about travel restrictions, travel bans, border walls. It was all about not being able to move. And so I feel like that just kind of came out as I was writing, that it was an essential conflict, that borders had to be essential, that traveling had to be something made explicit and difficult, and just kind of thinking about that on the long term. I knew, like, I wish I were an outliner. I know, Sarah, you wish I were an outliner. But for me, I just write toward images. And so I was just like writing towards these different landscapes. And then it became populated with like kind of a distilling. of what was going on in like kind of the atmosphere, right? So for me, the book was unplanned in what it touched on, but it's like the rain that comes out, right? Everything collects in the sky around you and you hear it and it goes in, and then what comes out is what you were kind of immersed in without realizing it. Like I had just traveled to Philadelphia from the desert, and so I was like, there was very much this thing happening. I was going into higher academia and realizing that like, it's not like less racist in the Northeast, it's just super polite in the Northeast, and like seeing all of these different things. And I wanted to have that conversation. I just didn't even know that I wanted to have it. And so the book became a vessel for all of those conversations that I didn't know I needed to have with myself and with the world around me.
Much. The image of it collecting like rain and all
I know, that was
together.
beautiful.
It was
It was
beautiful.
beautiful.
Tolkien has the ooze, but it's just not as sexy.
Thank you. Heather, if you want to take it next.
So I also wish I was an outliner so badly. Like I would have written books way less times than I have written them. I'm about to turn in the sequel to Malice, and I told someone today, and I think it's true, that this is probably the 5th time I've rewritten it from the ground up. And that'd be real great if I could just like think about what I was going to write before I wrote it.
Yep.
It's like all of those little 3rd grade box prompts that they gave you, you know, where you like fill in each part of your paper. That's completely just gone. Like that meant nothing to me. Did nothing to help me. Thank you, Miss Poole. Anyway. But when I started Malice, actually, the first chapter of Malice actually came together very quickly. And then I did wind up rewriting it, of course, because that's what I do. But the overall story, the bones were there from start to finish, and the bones came together very swiftly for me. And I knew that I wanted a female villain main character. And I knew that historically in literature, female villains are portrayed a certain way. And typically their motives are very superficial, or what society would give to a woman. And those being, she wants to be the prettiest. She wants to marry the prince, or marry up at least. She wants to scratch out the faces of her other female contemporaries. She wants a baby, like all of these things. There's nothing wrong with these things, but I cannot tell you, aside from Dorian Gray, a single male protagonist villain who wants to be the handsomest one at the ball. And so he murders all the other guys. And so I really disliked that female villains were being portrayed as being these very superficial, very flat, didn't really want to be ambitious. And then historically, the ambitious females like Anne Boleyn are completely just erased or portrayed as these horrible people, these homewrecker, you know, we're not looking at their strengths as people. So I wanted to create this female villain who had layers and who was complex, but it was very difficult because I didn't want to fall into the trap of I guess some people online have called it like woobifying, like making this like, oh, poor me, like feeling really bad for the villain. I didn't want to do that either. I wanted this female villain who didn't necessarily wake up one morning and decided she wanted to wreak havoc everywhere she went. Like she's got triggers, she's got layers, but she makes bad decisions sometimes. And like, that's okay. She's selfish sometimes, and that's okay. I wanted to create a real person that readers can see themselves in. Like you guys were kind of talking about how science fiction kind of portrays our world, even though it's not real. It's like you said, so much of our world just isn't real, but that doesn't mean that we can't see ourselves within fantasy. And sometimes that's even liberating to see a character that we identify with find their powers and come into their own. I mean, we don't have magical powers, so to speak, like not like we see on the page, unfortunately, but we can find ourselves and finally see ourselves and understand our worth. And I wanted a female villain who did that, even if it meant that finding her worth and finding her powers might not mean great things for the rest of the characters in the book, but it was great for her. Wanted to do that.
I love that. I love, because like that's such a rich premise, and like so many stories that like ostensibly are about that don't follow through on like the villainy of the main character, because they're like save the cat, make the protagonist like safe and likable and whatever, and like not a real person really. And yeah, I just like applaud you for going.
Yeah, thanks. And going off that unlikable, like how many times do we see complex female characters on the page and they're unlikable? It just boggles my mind. Like so many in Julie C. Dow's Force of a Thousand Lanterns. I saw so many reviews of that book where it came out like she's unlikable, she's unlikable. I'm like, guys, she's nuanced.
Yeah.
She has layers. She is just as complex as a male character, and we have to get past this. Like only male characters get to have these layers, and we can only like Kylo Ren's.
Simon, if you'd like to close us out on this one.
Sure. Sorry, what was the question?
No, right.
No problem. I got
it was about themes and issues you wanted to tackle in the book.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, got it. I like that this panel is like all of us coming out and saying to the world we're really shitty planners, because I also am really bad at planning and outlining. I think probably like the two of you, like my writing process is very generative, where it's like you're writing from the image, or you're writing from an idea, and a sentence leads into the next. You're kind of like in the act of writing, the story fleshes itself out, and the world kind of builds itself out from there, from the core, from like the seed of wherever you started from. And it's a really scary proposition to start out that way, but it often like leads to really organic and interesting work, at least that I've found. In terms of themes and issues that were intentional, none whatsoever. But in the act of like of iteration and revision and rewriting over and over again, that stuff just like naturally comes out because you're feeling your way through the story, right? And you're kind of like chipping away all the cruft that's not part of the story in your head, and the stuff you choose to keep in there is the stuff that you're obsessed with, or you're thinking about, or you fantasize about, or whatever. And I feel like at the end of my writing career, if someone's, I'm going to have written about the same thing over and over again, and someone's going to be able to look at this author and be like, that is one really lonely and horny gay man. Which I'm totally cool with. It's like whatever, but themes and issues, intimacy is a big one. I read a lot about that, I found in my past. And intimacy, time, traveling to a place that you've been to once in your childhood and returning again like years later, and feeling that weird dissonance mixed with nostalgia. And there's like probably like a bunch of other shit like that I was thinking about, like from day to day, like the issue in my mind changes. So it's like I can't really chart what's in there, but hopefully some 5-star Goodreads reviews will tell me.
Well, you've kicked me into the next question pretty nicely. Thank you for teeing me up.
You're welcome.
You do write a lot about connections and intimacy and relationships, and in fact, all of you write about relationships of all kinds: romantic, platonic, familial. All of those are central to each of your books. But what I'd love to talk about is your relationship to your characters. Did any part of yourselves show up in your characters while you were writing, intentionally or not? Is there any character in particular who you had a really difficult time writing, or one who showed up on the page effortlessly? Heather, if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, I was pretty lucky with Malice. Alice just showed up one day, showed up, took a seat, and I was just like, oh, hello. So she was great. Just this walking ball of anger, very petty a lot of the time. And I identified with her a lot. I wouldn't say that the book is autobiographical in any way, but just Alice's upset at the world around her and how she feels like she doesn't fit in. I certainly didn't go through the same level of bullying that Alice does in the novel, but just that feeling of wanting more and feeling trapped, I definitely identified with. And I like to say that Alice is like the little voice that lives in my head, because she does a lot of the things that I would like to do and says a lot of the things that I don't have the courage to say. So she it was almost like a cheap of therapy to be like, and what would I want to do in this situation? She's gonna do it. So I loved that about Alice. The one character that I really had a hard time with, interestingly enough, was Aurora, because my focus was so much on Alice, and Aurora in the book is the traditional Sleeping Beauty princess. And what I hate most about the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale is how flat the Sleeping Beauty character is. Like the tale is well named because that princess just sleeps. Like that is all she does in every single version. She is conked out for most of the time until she wakes up and marries the prince like immediately, or in some versions wakes up pregnant and like then is like, oh, how'd this happen? Better go find the dad. And so like that's the rest of the story. So I really disliked that. And I wanted to create a princess who wanted to be princess, not necessarily sword wielding, not that there's anything wrong with that, but someone who actually wanted to rule and felt like she should, because in a lot of the versions, not just the Disney one, the princess is shipped off so that she doesn't accidentally poke her finger on the spindle. And I'm looking at this, watching it as an adult going, she's your heir. Like she's the one who's coming next. You guys don't think, you feel like the fairies in the woods are going to teach you how to be a good leader for your kingdom? Like, anyway, but when the first drafts of the novel, Aurora wasn't clicking, and I didn't even realize it until I got it back after a round of edits and I read it and I was like, oh God, I've made the sleeping princess sleeping. Like she was so boring through most of the novel. Everything happened to her. Everything was somebody else's idea. And so I really challenged myself to create this character who was outspoken, who was feminist, who didn't really care about what anybody else thought. There is a question of her privilege and, where she comes from, because she's extremely wealthy. She comes from a powerful family. And so that kind of is interesting that she and Alice are together, because Alice is kind of a pariah and she is this very privileged person. But I really wanted to make her someone that readers could also relate to and not asleep. That was like my main goal, was awake the majority of the time.
Wait, most of it I can confirm. Simon, if you'd like to go next.
Yeah. Characters that are like me or that I saw myself in, all of them, really. At least like anytime like there's a character that does something that you kind of cringe at, that's me. And like whenever they're brave or open emotionally or vulnerable, that's like what I wish on my best days I am like, or would be like. In terms of characters that were hard to write, I don't know if there were many. There's a brief romance between two young gay men in it that I found hard to write, in that it is hard for me to get out, because it's something I want to write about, but it's also hard for me to like get myself out of like the old fantasies I have, whereas like flat Ken doll characters kind of being mashed together, where it's hard to make them alive and interesting and their own people. Because in order to do that, I have to kind of divorce myself from the situation and not be so involved in like the old high school regressions that I still find myself sometimes stuck in, of like modes of thinking about romance and stuff like that. So that can be tough for me. And I have to like put extra effort into making those kind of things interesting, even though like that's the kind of thing I want to write about most. So it's like a weird curse that I have to deal with. A character that was really easy to write, there's a character who is like an effete socialite who's very hyperverbal and loves language. And that's always a very easy character to write, because they want to talk, and no matter how insignificant their thought is, they'll let it out. So it's very easy to kind of channel that into the keyboard.
You both have had to sort of, I guess, to steal your sentence a little bit, divorce yourselves from your characters, take a step back and be like, how do I come back at this character in a different way? Mikaya, if you'd like to close us out on this one.
Yeah, for sure. I think I get asked a lot, understandably, like if I base Kara on myself, there's a lot of me in Kara. And my response is always kind of, I wish. Because for me, like I see so much of like my older sister in Kara and all these like kind of the strong women I was raised with who were like the first to leave, like who made the path that enabled me to be able to get out, like those, the first one who leaves your hometown type deal. And so for me, my relationship is always like kind of like that warms me towards Kara always, where it's like the same, just like with family, where it's like, well, this person's gonna screw up, whatever, we're gonna roll with it. We see what makes them valuable, even when other people do not. And so, yeah, absolutely. I feel like the character that I fear seeing in myself, and I do, I will not, it's the villain, but I won't say the villain's name because I'm not egotistical enough to believe everybody's read my book, but I am egotistical enough to believe everybody will read my book. So I will not spoil it. But the character, the villain, is the one that I am most afraid of, like seeing myself in, where it's like you can justify so much with ambition, depending on where you come from, where it's like all things are all things are sanctioned in that like kind of race to get ahead. And I have to, like, that's what I worry about for myself. Cause like, when you're kind of raised like scrambling, you never stop to think about like the right and wrong way to survive, So that's something that like, I keep myself on my toes in that way. In this way, like my book is very much an inhabitants where an inhabited space of just all these different people I know, but also all these different people I could be. As far as difficult to write, I think the hardest character for me to write was absolutely Dell, because Dell is proper and has clean fingernails and we have nothing in common. But also because like I think the configuration of women that Dell represents for me are women who I did not understand at the time until it was too late. And that's how the story plays out. And so it is like writing this mistake that I've already made over and over again of like these women that I couldn't actually like read between the lines on. I come from like very bombastic kind of social circles, and we're going to say it. And even within my household, we just like fight outright. And so the people who like play their cards close to the chest and like have that mask have always been like the enigma to me. Like quiet people fascinate me. I just follow them around. And so it's like kind of that was always difficult for me because it's like I didn't understand like this configuration when I encountered it. And here I am translating onto the page, and very little has changed about that. So it was a lot of work of, trying to go through and like stepping outside of myself.
I also weirdly thought of Kara as like my sister, so it's nice to hear sort of
everybody's sister.
She's everybody's sister. She's everybody's much cooler older sister.
Yes.
Love her. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Your books all imagine different realities, a new vision of a past fairy tale in Malice, a look at many possible worlds only degrees different from our present in the space between worlds, and a peek into a far-flung corporatized future in The Vanished Birds. What was your world-building process like in envisioning these stories? Simon, if you want to kick us off.
Process? Like, what? No,
yeah, just gonna go back and cry at how unprepared we are.
She's like, oh, that's why he keeps missing all of his deadlines. Okay, got it.
I promise this wasn't an elaborate setup for me to bully all of you into writing outlines. And
I don't know. It really feels like that, Sarah.
It does.
I feel very attacked and also seen, so thank you. Yeah, world building process. Again, as I said before, most of it's through revision and iteration, where I write the story that I feel in the day, and then like that's dog shit afterwards, and then you fix it, and then you write the next piece, and then you try to keep it on this inside the same universe, and it's just like brick by brick like that, because I don't outline because I'm a fool.
I'll get you to write an outline for me. Kaya, if you want to go next.
Yeah, for sure. So for me, I feel like in the moment, I think I'm being super creative and I'm inventing all these things. And then after it comes back or after I get feedback, I discover that it's just like some world that I know, but through like a kaleidoscope, like kind of a funhouse mirror version. I recently like revisited home and I went to Oro Grande, which is this even smaller desert town than my desert town. And it's next to a cement factory and everything was covered in gray. And I was like, oh shit, I thought I was good at this, but I just stole this from my hometown, like everything else. But I also kind of love that. I don't know. I think there are ways in which we make things more accurate. I don't know if you guys we're going out with the references, you guys, just so you know. I don't know if you've seen the movie Big Fish, but that kind of idea where it's like technically what he was saying was incorrect, but saying that the two people who stood next to each other all the time were actually conjoined twins conveys a closeness that telling the truth didn't. And so like that idea that in the fantastic, you're actually saying something more true than the real truth. And this is just totally piggybacking off of what Simon said earlier that was so great, where it is just that like idea of like, you're not necessarily building a world, or for me, I'm not necessarily building a world, I'm translating one into like a literalness that makes it gigantic. Like, you know, maybe most poverty in this country isn't separated by a literal actual wall between nice areas, but like there is redlining and there are these things that are these kind of invisible walls. And so it really is just stealing. Basically, I'm very lazy is what I'm telling you, Sarah. I just take the things that I've been seeing and translate them into more fantastic versions.
She's going to fire us. Stop.
I know.
I would never.
We're so bad at this.
I would never. All right. So what I'm getting so far is stealing brick by brick. Heather, would you like to add on to this?
Oh, for sure. I feel like we could argue that almost all worlds, I really can't think of a world in a book that hasn't been stolen from something. Like it's all coming from something, you know, whether it's the castles from Western Europe or Shadow and Bone and the Tsar punk like Leigh Bardugo coined for herself. Like it's all based on something because we have to, right? If we created something that was just so utterly fantastical, it truly did originated in our own brains. I don't even know if it would do very well because everybody would just be like, there's no roots, like there's nothing for a reader to latch onto. And so for me, what I based Briar, the world off of, I thought about, okay, the only thing that I really know about this world from the Grimm story is that they have gold plates. They sound rich. So I thought about what kind of world would have magic and be super rich and just be so far removed from everything else. And it reminded me a lot of Versailles in France, because it's like they're sort of in Paris, but not. And if you've ever been to Versailles, it's really, I mean, right now it's like across the street from a McDonald's, but back in the day, it used to be a hunting lodge and it was out in the middle of nowhere and it was on this big land and you have the enormous palace itself, but then you also have like these little like mini palaces on the grounds that the royal family used to just like go escape to when they were like bored of their big palace. Like it's wild when you think about how that family, the Bourbons, used to live. Crazy. And so I researched Versailles, and that was kind of the aesthetic that I was going for in the world of Briar, this kingdom, queendom that is just completely out of touch with the entire rest of the world. It's so wealthy that it's wrapped up in itself. And it's even so wealthy that, of course, we have the different districts, the Grace district, which is where all of the nobles and the aristocracy lived. But there is still poverty, even in this like realm that has enough gold to make enchanted gowns. There is poor people living there. So the world based off Versailles really kind of highlighted for me this different class like of citizen where you have this extreme wealth and you have this extreme not, and Alice is living kind of somewhere in the middle because she's technically in the Grace district because of her magic and the nobles want her there so they can access that magic, but she absolutely doesn't belong. And so based off that, I thought, okay, well, what else would this world do with magic? What else? How would, and again, with rooting our own experience in our magical fantasy worlds or sci-fi worlds, if a world like that had all this money and then they had magic at their fingertips, they would absolutely capitalize on that. And so the magic system in the book is a capitalist system where the Graces have to create these elixirs and sell them to the nobility, and they're regulated and there's a council, and if they don't do things right, they can get punished for it. So yeah, there's history woven into the world building, but also some things from our own lives that we can kind of understand. And like I said, I would be very interested to read the book that came from absolutely nowhere, because we're all conditioned, right? Like all of our brains were formed taking in all of this media and these stories. To have a truly original tale that came from nowhere would be a very interesting read.
Yeah, and just to jump off of that, I think that's really well put. And it's when someone creates a world without being aware of where those images are coming from, that's where you like fall into that trap of like, yeah, I wrote this really villainous country from across the ocean that's coming to pillage our land, and the hero has to massacre all of them in order to save everyone. It's like, you wrote East Asia. It's like
Yes.
That exists.
not being aware of that conditioning or your own experiences and where you're pulling these ideas from, because they do come from somewhere. You don't live in a vacuum, as Heather said. It's like it's talking about reimagining the future in contemporary days today. Like, the one thing that authors should be doing now more than ever is just being aware of where they're pulling their ideas from, because you live in a world, not a town, not a house. Yes. You live in a world.
Yes. And Heather, especially because you're doing kind of like these kind of fairy tale retellings. And so often those go awry where it's like, oh, I just ported this kind of medieval fairy tale. I am not anti-Semitic. I just didn't know it was. And like that kind of thing happens, because it's like you just being aware of like, it's so much, I'm just saying like props to you, because that takes like extra research where it's just like, there's nothing is without strings, right? Nothing is without blood. And like having to go through like all those different things. And also like one thing about world building that you mentioned that I've always thought of, where it's like the inescapable, like what can't you escape? And for you and I, it was capitalism, right? Like you can have a fairy tale, but to ignore that if there's classes, then somebody's going to be like using like capitalism is being deployed in some way. And just to confront that head on, I think it's just so smart, because there are some things that you want to reinvent and some things that are more interesting if you don't escape them. And I just think that was such a great decision. Yeah,
like it's not to say like don't do it, but just be intentional about it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, just work.
Yeah.
I have loved every moment of this conversation. We have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you 2 more quick questions. I'm cheating a little bit with this next one since I work with y'all, but what is coming in the future from each of you? Mikaya, if you'd like to go first.
Okay, I'm going to be very careful because I don't know when this is coming out. But usually when I'm like, oh, I can't tell you, it's because Sarah wouldn't want me to tell you, and you're the one asking me. So I'm just going to say things that are exciting are what I'm working on. I'm just gonna rock it all the way back before I get in trouble. She's in the room, Simon. She can hear me.
The mystery, the intrigue. I love it. Exciting things are coming soon. Heather, if you'd like to take it next.
So I have the sequel to Malice will hopefully be out this time next year. It has, I read before I started writing the book that, book 2s are hard. And I was like, yeah, book 2s are hard. No, book 2s are hard. Like, why did I sign up for this? Like, it is really just kicking me. It is giving me such a hard time. It's a pill. I'm really excited to share it with the world.
Stupid thing that I hate. I'm gonna share it.
That's it. I often get asked, because it's a science fiction book and there's so many science fiction trilogies and stuff. They're like, so you're gonna write a sequel, right? I'm like, are you out of your mind? That sounds like the most stressful thing in the fucking world. So like, props to you for doing it, but like I
have to. They made me sign.
You signed it.
Coming back. I was like, it's actually, and here's like a little like author confession. When I wrote Malice and I got to the end, and I won't spoil the end, but it is an ending with a capital E. And I thought, oh, like, I feel like people can kind of connect this to the original tale, and this is fine. Like, it ends here, like it's a standalone, whatever. And Trish and I had our conversation about it before the offer, and she was like, "Well, your readers are gonna want more Alice," and I was like, "Okay, I mean, I guess probably I can. Yeah, sequel, sure." And then I was just like, I don't know. And so after Malice has been out for about 6 weeks now, and Trisha was right. Like, if Malice was a standalone, I might be like afraid for my life. Like, people are tagging me and like asking me where to send their therapy bills. I'm getting tagged in TikToks with like people crying or like yelling and screaming. And so it's like no pressure on this sequel. But yeah, she was right, as editors often are.
Yeah, watch out for those TikToks, man.
I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna eat that up. And yeah, I'm not saying I sent an all caps email to Trisha saying more Alice, but I'm not saying that. And Simon, what is next for you, sir?
Can I also pull a Micaiah and just say exciting things?
Nice. God, you
I'll say
With
something.
my blessing, with my blessing.
Thank you, Micaiah. I'm writing almost done, kind of, with a fantasy novel this time, not science fiction. It's a mythic fantasy about two warriors who who are on the run through a country ravaged by a tyrannical despot. And it's an adventure, a little bit of romance, a little bit of action. It's pretty cool. That's it.
I'm gonna say very, very cool. And every time I get to reread it, I scream for joy just a little bit more loudly.
And she has to reread it a lot because I sent her a lot of copies.
I love it. Okay, so I'm gonna have this be our final question so that we wrap up in time. So looking towards the future, what do you predict for the future of science fiction and fantasy storytelling? I like to go broad as a final question. Heather, I'm gonna kick it to you.
I don't know if it's a prediction or more of a hope. But I know, like, seeing what's coming out, I'm really hoping that this trend of very complex, morally gray female characters starring in fantasy and sci-fi roles continues. I know Tasha Suri's Jasmine Throne is coming out next month, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It is two women who are exactly like that. The romance in that is amazing, but I just really want to see this continue, and also just more inclusivity in general, because I feel like our readers, part of the reason I became a librarian is I really want to make sure that readers see themselves in stories. It's so important that there's not just one story, and I think fantasy has fallen into this trap of being based all Western Europe, all white characters, all straight relationships. And mine is a couple of those. So like I'm part of that. But it also has the female romance. And so just more inclusivity so that more readers can see themselves represented, and especially inclusivity by marginalized authors who deserve to be able to tell their stories and include readers in their stories as well. So that's what I'm hoping continues.
Simon, if you want to take it next.
My prediction for the future of science fiction fantasy. I have no idea. I have no idea, and that's really awesome. I think that, like Heather, I think that there's a continuing trend of like more diversity in the fiction, more better representation. So it's not just like the narrative center is being decentered and it's focusing more on the characters who used to be like the best friends or the tragic side story that kind of gives the world more grit, but they're now like the centerpiece of the novel, which is awesome. But I want to like try to project. It'll be like, there's going to be like some new form of the novel probably in like 1,000 years. There's going to be like in VR with like cod pieces on, just exploring these erotic worlds. And that's my vision for the future.
Simon, this does not count as an outline to me for your next book. Mikaya, if you want to close us out.
Yes, well, that's a lot of pressure. We should have ended on VR cod pieces. This was your mistake, Sarah, in the organizing. I would say that the most exciting thing for me to think about the future of science fiction is more, I guess, thinking about how science fiction can respond to the world differently. I feel like we are at a time between like Anthropocene and AI and should we colonize Mars, where like all of the questions of the day are science fiction questions, right? Like so much is becoming so much more relevant. And that line between, like we talked a lot about that, like kind of falsely imposed line between science fiction as a genre and like literary as a genre and all these different genres. It gets more and more destabilized as, you know, like we say, like the concept of reality becomes less and less useful. And we're in a place where like, what is reality? Like AI, we're science fiction 20 years ago, and now I can ask my nice phone lady to give me directions, you know? So I guess I'm really excited about how science fiction will respond, like how it's going to raise the stakes of opening up other worlds when we are so close to catching up. You know, it's kind of the William Gibson problem. He makes cyberspace becomes real. And then you've got to just keep updating. And so far we've been doing it by opening it up to other worlds that are not just like, you know, like white dudes in spaceships, like kissing green ladies, right? We've like kind of opened up to other worlds that way. And I'm just excited to see what comes next and how science fiction kind of evolves to deal with the problem of the world catching up with it. I just love that idea of what it becomes. And my personal hope would be that a lot of these kind of generic walls that don't serve us as much kind of crumble a little bit more, because we can all name like literary fiction novels with science fiction elements, and we can all, and anyway, this is a rant for another time. I'm off the soapbox. That is all I will say, is that I hope we interrogate genre more.
That's a great answer. I love it, and I agree. I'm trying to make my answer better by feeding off of yours.
Yeah.
Taking credit for it. So.
All right, folks, we are almost out of time, but before we go, I wanted to ask each of you, if the folks at home want to stay updated on what's next for y'all, where can they reach you? Heather?
I'm on Twitter, Insta, and now TikTok, which is horrifying. And it's actually super fun, but yeah, I'm old on there. But I am at Heather R. Walter 5 on all of those platforms.
Simon?
I'm on nothing. You can find my author website at simonjimenezauthor.com, and that's it. Stay away from me.
And finally, Mikaya?
I am on Twitter, where you can watch me yell at people unproductively, if you so choose, because if this wasn't enough. And that's just at Micaiah_Johnson on Twitter. Otherwise, my website is also my name, so that makes it easy.
Thank you all for joining me today and having such a lovely and wonderful conversation. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their Comic-Con at home experience. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.